Good morning. It may not be morning for you, but it certainly is for me. Too early, in fact. But wherever you are, whatever time it is, welcome. So today we move to ancient Greece, as you see on the screen, and we'll divide this unit, this PowerPoint, this lecture into two parts. The first on politics, and the second on Greek thought. The political part of this will focus primarily, though not exclusively, on the city-state of Athens and its gradual move towards democracy as a form of government, a form of government that will be new for us in this class. So one of the unique features of ancient Greece in the context of world history, going back this far, is its development of democracy, especially and primarily in Athens. Then we'll move to Greek thought in the second half of the lecture, and there we'll see that the Greeks pioneered philosophy, though there are certainly similarities with some of the units we've already looked at. Confucianism and the works of Confucius and his followers. There's comparable material here, because remember, we are still in the axial age, that period that historians note now, where there are similar happenings and similar developments throughout the world. And in our class, the way it's structured, the four civilizations to really, I think, look at to see how striking some of the comparisons are in this period. Two of them we've already covered, China and India, and two we're about to cover now and next, Greece and Rome. So look for on your own. I'll point out some myself as we go along. Similarities between the Greeks and the Romans on one side of the world and the Chinese and Indians on the other side. In Greek thought, when we get to that portion of the lecture, we'll focus primarily on the big three, as they're sometimes called: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But there are some others that figure into it as well. So we first look at the Greeks' propensity to think mythically, as so many peoples do. We haven't focused on it as much in other units, but we could have. We focused on religion, not so much myth. But Greek myths are quite well known to Americans, partly because it's been a part of our educational system for a long time. It's not as much true any longer, but it's still somewhat true. For better or worse, it has been part of our standard education for decades. So when we're saying here with a question mark, the Greeks are moving from myth to reason, or question mark, are they? It means, are they moving from a reliance on the gods and religious belief to explain their world to reason and logic and evidence and data to understand their world? And the answer is yes, sort of, primarily. And other peoples of the world, some of whom we've already looked at, the Indians, the Chinese, were doing something similar as well. It might be more pronounced in the case of Greece, but that's open to argument. So how much is it true that the Greeks are moving in the time period we're studying here? When we start mainly using mythical, religious thinking to explain their world, when we get to the end of the centuries we're dealing with in the Axial Age, are they, has myth been replaced, religious thought been replaced by reason, at least in terms of understanding the world and decision making, etc.? The answer, I think, is a partial yes. In history, the answers are often partial ones, and they're kind of yeses and nos, and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But part of the reason it's not a complete yes is, number one, the Greeks were not that much different from other peoples around the world, and they then, secondly, sort of mixed a capacity to think mythically and rationally together. So it's not totally true to say it was a hardcore move from myth and eradicating myth eventually, and it being 100% replaced by reason. There's more of a relationship between mythos and logos. So they're separate, but equally legitimate avenues to truth as far as Greek thought was concerned. And the logos shows up, and we'll see it in a later unit, In Western religion, particularly Christianity, or exclusively Christianity at first, in the Gospel of John, logos is the idea of reason, but reason sort of coming from a divine basis. So that God is reasonable, the Word. So even as far back as the Greeks, which is long, at least here, long before Christianity, there was already a sense that reason and myth were still connected. They're still, they're not opposites. It's not a conflict between myth and reason, mythos and logos. They work sort of towards the same goals. They both, again, work, they both can be avenues to truth, and there's certainly a lot of overlap there. They're not opposites in any way. Next, I ask, how can a myth be factually false but still true? Myths sometimes have a grain of truth to them anyway, but are always stretched beyond what's true or can be true. Sometimes myths can be completely false and don't have any truth value. So let's take the latter case since it's more extreme. How could we say that a myth, that the story about the past that isn't true at all, how could we then say that it's still true in any way at all? Or can we say that? I think we can. And really, I think this is a crucial point to understand when talking about myths, ancient or otherwise, and that is they have a truth value not in the factual sense, but in the sense of myth being a guiding force for a people, their myths, their culture. So if a myth or a group of myths that are part of a people's religious beliefs, part of their cultural beliefs and customs, if those myths help them to come together and stay together as a political and cultural unit. We've talked about various forms of glue that hold societies together, and that religion might be the primary one. Well, myths are part of religion in the ancient world, and again, even into the modern world, so that we can say that myths are true as far as the stories they tell help to educate citizens, the young at first, but everyone, to know how to be a Greek or a Roman or an Indian, so that the myths help them to understand what their culture expects of them, the rules, the customs, the mores, the do's, the don'ts, how to take their place in the world, how to understand the world from their culture's perspective. Not that they have any other perspective, so that's why they often see this, at least if you go back far enough, as literally true, and then maybe it declines somewhat from there. But even if and when people start to think or suspect that the myths aren't literally true, most people still see a certain value in this, a certain truth still in the myths. So I think myths can be true in the sense that they help to transmit the culture, and they help through that keep the culture and the people together, sort of as one cultural unit. Speaking of myths, we get to the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the great two classics written by Homer, whoever the hell Homer was, and we don't really know, and I don't think we'll ever truly know. In fact, there are some scholars that believe that the Iliad and Odyssey were actually written by two different people, but there was a person apparently named Homer that some scholars think wrote one or both of these great epic poems, classics. They're written in poem form, but in the ancient world and up until really the modern world, poems were often written almost like novels, extremely long. Whatever method of rhythm or pattern there was to the wording, they were oftentimes extremely long. So these in some ways are more like novels. So when we say epic poems, it can be somewhat misleading. So why are these books which are now considered classics of literature for good reason. They're very well written and seem to have that universal quality required for something to be considered literature, and that is showing a keen understanding of human nature, the human condition, sort of common themes about humanity, whatever time and place it's being written in. And clearly, the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, have those qualities. But from an historian's perspective, this is much more mundane or seemingly boring, but they're invaluable primary sources. In fact, they're doubly useful primary sources. I say doubly because Homer, or whoever it was, wrote these after the era of the Trojan Wars and the Mycenaean period, as it's known in Greece, which is kind of like the prelude or foundations for the classical age of Greece, sort of the height and the more famous era that comes a little bit later on. So he's writing, he was writing just after the Mycenaean period, but he was writing about the Mycenaean period. So there's a mix of things happening there and elements of Greek culture from two different time periods. In some places he's talking about things and the way they were done and the way they were said and they were thought about by the Greeks in the Mycenaean period, and in some places, without telling the reader, of course, that he's making a change, and probably not even aware of it himself, he is then shifting to the ways things were done in his period, hundreds of years after the fact. So we get kind of a 2-for-1 primary source, or 2-for-1 dual source in the Iliad and the Odyssey, in that they deal with two separate time periods in Greek history, kind of one time period after the next. Now, it's been excruciating hard work, I'm sure, for scholars to go through, and first they had to realize this, and secondly then to pick out and find out, comparing it with other documents and other evidence we have, historical, archaeological, etc., from the two time periods, and find out which portions and which things that are said, which stories are told, seem like they came from the Mycenaean period and were kind of holdovers, or Homer was writing about, intentionally writing about the past, and which things and where in the documents was Homer, talking about things from a present perspective. So this is obviously painstaking, it has been painstaking work. So first and foremost, from an historical perspective, since this is a history course, the Homeric works are invaluable primary sources. Remember, a primary source is simply anything written down in the time period being studied that survived, so that it can be looked at later on to try to piece together an understanding of that time and place and people and its history. And there's no doubt that the Iliad and the Odyssey do that, because they're long, and particularly you get a great deal of useful knowledge about their values, about how they viewed the world, their world view. View the world, worldview. So a record of Greek values. That's sort of the second way in which they're significant from an historian's perspective. We see all kinds of attention paid to what were some of the most important values to the Greeks. Arete, pursuit of excellence, combination of thought and action. Some of these might sound as obvious values, like combination of thought and action, but the Greeks kind of took this to a new level, and you can see it in the Homeric classics again and again and again. You're not supposed to just rush off headlong into battle, but you're supposed to think things through carefully before taking any kind of risky or important action. Far later in history than this, believe it or not, in many parts of the world, sometimes large-scale activity takes place, large-scale projects, let's just say warfare, without a great deal of planning ahead of time. Sometimes it's because people, say the Christian crusaders in the Middle Ages, this is true to some degree of them, They don't think they need really a systematic plan, because the thinking was, well, we'll just show up with our swords and our suits of armor and shields, and God will sort of point the way. God will figure out how to do this for us, and sort of we'll see a sign when we get there. So the combination of thought and action, and sort of fusing them together consciously, is a value not unique to the Greeks, but it's not as widespread as you might think. It's not a no-brainer for the entire world. The pursuit of excellence, this shows that the Greeks were very much focused on living life to its fullest in this world. We'll see that in Greek thought and philosophy as well, which also gives us, of course, important knowledge about Greek values. But we see it as far back as the Homeric epics, which again were written just at the end of the Mycenaean period and just before the beginning of the classical period that we're going to be spending most of our time on. So when we get into kind of the meat of this lecture, the classic Homeric poems, Iliad and the Odyssey, were already standard fare, maybe the standard educational fare for students. So what they learned about their society, what they learned in school, so that they could go out into the world and become good Greeks, was largely a study of a poring over an understanding of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Also, we see, I have two number twos on there, I just realized, we see third, that Homer's gods formed the essence of Greek religion. So the third way in which these two great poems are historically significant, these two works of literature, is that they give us an understanding of the Greek gods, who they were, what their names were, but also what they stood for and what it tells us, what they tell us themselves about the Greeks' way of thinking about the world. After all, whether their gods were real or not, I'm staying agnostic on that point with regard to every religion we deal with in this class, or every people's religious views. But they're still a reflection in one way or another of the people's own views. And so that's true of the Greeks like it is everyone else. We next get to the rise of the polis, the Greek word for city-state, and we see not a new form of political organization for us, but the Greeks sort of do something different with it here. We saw city-states in ancient Sumer, for instance. So the first civilization was composed of the first part of Mesopotamia to be urbanized, saw not one empire or one kingdom, but we know had about a dozen of them that were at least theoretically independent of each other. So a similar setup happens here. The city-state, and you can see in the map in the upper right, kind of the breakdown of city-states by color. Some of them were on islands as far away as the western tip of what's now Turkey, which you see on the right of the screen, where it says Ionia in very small letters, green and kind of a what is that? I don't know, red, light red, pink there. And on the left is mainland Greece, where Athens is, where Sparta is, etc. So, and that's a pretty small amount of territory overall to be split into that many, different political units that are, politically sovereign in their own right. Again, theoretically at least. Sometimes in reality, this is power spread out quite a bit. So, why did city-states appear in Greece? We're not going to need to get into that a great deal. A lot of it is geography. So, they, although close together, as we see the city-states were, there's a lot of mountainous terrain, a lot of waterways. As you can see, they're islands. So whether it be mountains or water, some of these places were as more remote from each other than you may think. By the sort of crow's eye, they might be close together, but in actually getting there, they were much more separated. So that kind of those kind of geographic barriers do lend themselves to separate political systems as well as different cultures developing. Although it's, I think, prudent to point out right here near the beginning that the Greeks, all these different colored sort of places, did share a culture, did share a language, more or less. There are different dialects, and there are even some different languages in there, but for the most part, there was something generally that we could call Greek culture, which would include language, which is pretty much the same. So they had a lot that sort of drew them together and bound them together, even though they were politically separate, and sometimes fought each other in brutal wars, sometimes allied with each other in brutal wars. So geographical proximity to each other, mainly by sea, those seem like contradictions, but I mean, geographic isolation and proximity at one and the same time, both as explanations for why city-states appeared. But I guess what's being said here is that there's kind of like a delicate split between how close they were together to influence each other, to establish and maintain a similar culture, and just enough isolation geographically, even though they're close together, to maintain differences and maintain their independence from each other politically. So this balance between isolation and proximity is a partial explanation. The various aristocracies, meaning the rich families that became powerful hereditarily, and they passed their power down and property down from one generation to the next, they tended not to move because they didn't have the will, one city-state or another, in the direction of unity, uniting into a larger sort of Greek whole. So aristocracies and nobilities around the world, when they can, tend to try to keep things static and keep power spread out and decentralized because it makes them bigger fish in a smaller pond. Also, I think an important explanation for why city-states in Greece and not in other places in the Mediterranean is because of the location in a different, broader sense here. Geography in a different sense. As you see at the bottom, number 4, on the periphery of big agrarian empires. So there were lots of bigger fish than the Greeks, certainly, especially since the Greeks are split up politically, as you see here. But they happen to be kind of just far enough away from the big empires to develop independently and go in this kind of unique direction because of the other factors we've talked about. The big worry for them in terms of not being able to do this, not being able to go their own way, was the Persian Empire by this time, which we'll get to in a later unit. But and we'll see also quite quickly here that the Persians were a legitimate threat to swallow up the Greek city-states because they tried on 2 occasions and came pretty close. So what makes the city-states, which include Athens and Sparta and others, Thebes, aren't as well known to us today, but there were dozens and dozens of them overall. What made them stand out from, I mean, in the context of our approach here, looking at world history, they were self-governing communities that expressed the free will of citizens, or the will of free citizens. So here's a pretty modern concept sort of coming to us here, and that is that the people here are thinking of themselves as citizens. We've seen pretty much subjects up until now. A subject is not quite the same as a citizen. A subject, of a king is subject to the will of the king. A citizen has what we today call rights, and they're not just passive and subject to the king's every whim and every edict that comes along. So this is already, as you, I think, can see, at least in the mind, a move towards democratic thinking, which will eventually move into democratic action and democratic institutions. Also, and this is gradual, it's not immediate, kind of part of the process of from myth, to reason, that law comes from human beings, not gods. That doesn't mean that once it gets to a belief that law comes from human beings, that gods aren't believed in any longer. It's just that more and more people in that society, in this case ancient Greece, or one city-state in Greece after another, come to believe that law itself, anyway, is created by human beings, not given by gods. So that's something that we haven't seen. When we looked at ancient Mesopotamia near the beginning of our class, we saw that there was a belief that the laws, Code of Hammurabi, was supposed to be given by a god to the aforementioned king, and thrown down kind of from the from heaven, or from the religious world into the human world. Before we get to Athens, we're going to stop at Sparta. Again, these two are really the only two city-states that get talked about and dealt with in courses like this, survey courses in world or Western civilization. And Sparta and Athens, it makes sense to talk about these two because they're the two most powerful ones, the most crucial ones. They're key allies at times. They fight in the biggest war against each other in all of Greek history as well. And they have a lot of features of their respective city-states, though they still share that Greek culture, so there are similarities, but they have lots of differences, which make for, I think, important contrasts as well. As one very good book on ancient Greece says it, the entire Spartan way of life was directed toward keeping the Spartan army at tip-top strength. Boys lived at home until their 7th year, when they were taken away to live in communal barracks until they were 30. They spent most of their time exercising, hunting, training with weapons, and being acculturated to Spartan values by listening to tales of bravery and heroism at the common meals presided over by older men. There they learned values consistent with the demands of the one honorable occupation for Spartan men as soldiers obedient to orders. So garrison state is actually apt. A garrison is like a fort, a stronghold for a military. So to call Sparta the garrison state, as many scholars have and do, is to say that this was a highly militarized state. And they didn't just, they weren't just about things martial during peacetime. This was a warlike garrison state 24/7. That's not to say they were at war all the time, but their society was militarized and basically prepared for war and thinking about war and doing things in sort of a military fashion all the time. Now, that came about through hard experience and Sparta's own unique history. At one point, early in its history, Sparta started to conquer neighboring city-states, and one of those that they conquered, the Helots, or a group that they conquered next door to them, the Messenians. I couldn't think of the name. The word Helot became attached to them, but that really meant slave. We tend to call them the Helots today, just sort of as the group. But the Messenians were their real names. They were conquered and enslaved by the Spartans, and the Helots then became their workers, by and large. And the workers, the slaves, outnumbered the Spartans, and that, of course, set itself up for ongoing long-term tension between the two. And indeed, there were rebellions of the Helots numerous times, but there was one big one, a Helot rebellion of large scale, say an attempted revolution, which was a civil war. Sparta had to marshal all of its resources and all of its manpower to put down the rebellion of their own slaves. And they did put the rebellion down, but at huge cost in life and treasure and everything else. And so it's that experience, and from that moment on, that leaders said, we can never allow something like that to happen again. Never. It can't happen. That was the starting point anyway of Sparta becoming militarized full time. And from there, they started to not only consider militarizing a good idea to keep potential internal rebellions down, but they became increasingly suspicious of, and you could say fearful of, attack from the outside by foreign powers or other Greek city-states that were kind of semi-foreign powers. So Sparta then develops this state of mind, this set of values, this culture that puts things military and military values at the top of the list and into the hearts and minds of everybody, not just the soldiers, but women, children, old people, everybody. Women there are some legends about this. I have no idea whether they're true or not. I don't think anyone does. They're myths, at the very least, but it does tell us something about the values. One woman, for instance, whose son was killed in battle and was consoled by neighbors, said, no, you don't need to console me. I bore this child, this son, so that he could defend and die for Sparta, and he has. So he's done his job, and I've done my job, producing a boy or boys. Whether that's true or not, the fact that it got passed down, and is still around, tells us something about at least the ideals, what was expected of people. Another woman apparently or allegedly told her son, who was going off to war, you either come home carrying your shield, you see shields there on the screen, or on top of your shield, but don't come home without your shield, which means you either come home a hero, carrying your shield and your full uniform, or you come back dead, being carried by someone else on top of your shield. You either come back a hero or dead, or the only other alternative that I don't want to hear, don't want to see, is you coming back without your shield, because that would mean that you dropped your shield and ran in retreat and in cowardice. So if the story is true, and perhaps it's not, but it does show then that this was sort of the expectation of everybody, to think in terms of what's best for the protection and defense of our society from a military point of view. Now, because the Spartans had such military prowess, and you can imagine it would be, I would think, intimidating if you were going into battle against this city-state, and they gained a reputation in time, so people knew who they were, that you knew you were going against soldiers that had been training full-time to be soldiers since they were 7 years old. They'd been living in military communities away from home full-time since they were 7 years old. So, if I was an Athenian or anyone else, knowing I'm going into battle tomorrow and may come face to face with somebody that's now a young adult but has been training to kill me since they were 7 years old, I'd be a little concerned, and one probably should have been concerned. That being said, I think we can oftentimes misunderstand Sparta's militarization and its garrison state status. There's no doubt that they were a formidable military and military society. You see this reflected in our popular culture today. How many teams, sports teams, how many mascots of high schools and colleges take the name Spartans? Michigan State Spartans, and there's tons of high schools across the country, but you don't ever see the such and such Athenians, do you? We'll see the Athenians could fight, but they're more known for culture and philosophy and literature, and poetry, and plays, drama. So that doesn't sound so good as sort of the emblem that goes on a football helmet. But Spartan always works. But again, all that's a little bit misleading, because though this was a formidable war-like society, they weren't as aggressive as some of the other city-states. In fact, the Athenians were far more aggressive in their foreign policy and their expansive warlike tendencies than the Spartans. The Spartans were much more defensive. And as I said before, some of this was sort of based on fear of another Helot uprising again. So in a sense, the Spartans' huge commitment to things military was more about sort of sending a message to everybody else: you better leave us alone. You better watch out who you're messing with, because it'll come back to bite you. So their garrison state, their full-time military preparedness, was more about defense than offense. Now that's not always true. I said at the outset they conquered some neighbors early on in their history, but the Athenians, who we're going to again compare and contrast with the Spartans, were far more aggressive militarily, even though they weren't organized as a military state 24/7. Which of course brings us to Athens and the rise, gradual I should say, of democracy. And reading from a current scholar, the Stanford political scientist Francis Fukuyama, one of the great political scientists today, government professors today, says the Athenians are commonly credited with having invented democracy in which rulers are not hereditary but selected by ballot. We've seen leaders primarily so far in place after place, era after era, that become leader because they're the eldest son of the king, and daddy eventually dies, and you get it because you inherited it. The Greeks have changed this now. So one of or the Athenians did. This spread to some degree to other city-states, but was always most potent and most concentrated in Athens by far. But this is something relatively new and unique, at least as far as what we've seen globally in this class. Most tribal societies are also relatively egalitarian and elect their rulers. But the Greeks went beyond this by introducing a concept of citizenship that was based on political criteria rather than kinship. So the author there is talking about hunter-gatherers, who we know, since we did a ton of work on them at the beginning of the semester, tend to be egalitarian. There's not as much hierarchy in hunter-gatherer groups, but they're usually small scale. So the Greeks were egalitarian, particularly the Athenians, and elected or selected their own rulers. They weren't hereditary, but what he's saying is they went beyond this by introducing, again, citizenship. So this means that political power was passed on not through kinship, not through blood, relatives, but sort of based on citizenship and other non-family criteria. The form of government practiced in 5th century Athens is probably better described as classical republicanism rather than democracy, since the franchise, or vote, was given only to a limited number of citizens, and there were sharp class distinctions that excluded large numbers of people, including the numerous slaves, from political participation. These were, moreover, not liberal states, but highly communitarian ones that did not respect the privacy or autonomy of their citizens. So Fukuyama makes some important qualifications there. This wasn't democracy by our modern standards, in at least most ways, or many ways, but it's moving that way. Even classical republicanism is a move in a democratic direction. It doesn't necessarily mean a society is intending to move farther in a democratic direction. Sometimes it may be, sometimes it may not be, but it is a move in that direction. But it's not complete democracy, since not everybody got to vote. Not everyone was considered a citizen, so there are a lot of limits there. Also, as he points out, this is a way of thinking about and doing politics that, though democratic, doesn't put as much emphasis on individual freedom and liberty as we've come to expect in the Western world, particularly the United States. I'm not saying there's none there. There's, if you're a citizen instead of a subject, as we already talked about, you certainly have sort of more individual rights than a subject, but not to the same degree that we expect in a modern democracy like the United States or the UK. So the process of gradually moving to democracy had something to do with events that occurred on their own, the underlying social, economic, demographic forces, underlying environmental forces that historians are so apt to say with truth are what move history in a certain direction. But there were certain individuals that came along in Greek history that pushed more deliberately in the direction of democracy. And I've, for time's sake, cut out some of them here. I'm just picking out one. But this is a famous moment and a famous point in the move, further and further along the line towards democracy. The reforms of Solon, which came in 594 BC. Now, we see yet again a common problem here, and that is it's hard to know from the primary sources, which are somewhat limited that far back in history, how much of the work and talk about the actions and ideas of Solon are myth and how much of them are reality. He was a real person, but it's possible that some of what's been written about him falls into the category of myth, the truth kind of stretched beyond what actually happened. But nonetheless, the reforms that came about to the political system itself do appear to have emanated from him. From the little we know about him, he did come from a wealthy, noble family. There's already nobilities in most of these cultures we're looking at here. So he came from a rich, powerful, hereditary family, and he was brought in partly because his intellect was reputed to be of the first caliber. So a smart aristocrat brought in to reform the laws. As Professor Freeman says, the book I've already been using, quoting, he was a pragmatic reformer, prepared to use his power to create a political system that would uphold, not offend, justice. Its essence was stability, with citizens acting with moderation and restraint towards each other under a respected system of law. The problem was how to mobilize opinion behind his curbing of the aristocracy without at the same time releasing unattainable expectations among the poor. So Solon was clever. He understood that for this to work, he'd have to strike a balance, and it was a delicate one, which could have gone wrong easily. Coming especially from the noble classes that he did, some of the nobles saw him as a traitor, surely, for giving away any reforms that benefited the poor, the average people, that gave them any say in government whatsoever. So he knew if he went too far in handing rights and freedoms and ability to participate in decision-making to citizens, he'd have a rebellion of his own class, the nobles, the elites, on his hands. But if he didn't go far enough and reform the system to give some benefits, throw at least a bone to the citizens, that he might have a civil war in his hands of the masses. So he saw the need, and he was right, to cut this down the middle. This is, I think, an important point for today, in that we tend to be more apt, especially in these times. We're used to, everything being immediate and on television and online, things being dramatic that appeal to us. The people that get on TV, whether it's the news or whatever else, are the most sort of demonstrative, those that sort of make the biggest splash and the biggest scene, because it's drama, right? It appeals to us. And we like this in politics as well. So, and I'm not talking about any specific person or party. It happens sort of across the political spectrum. But to me, the people that really, with exceptions, tend to move the ball in the right direction are moderates that have some sense of balance to them. They're not going sort of too far and too fast in one direction or another. And this is a classic case of it here with Solon's reforms. You can look at the reforms on your own, kind of in the upper left and in our textbook. But among them, he created a new institution called the Council of 400. Later, they added people to it, to 500. This is really appointed or elected administrators who formed kind of a larger and streamlined, organized bureaucracy for the first time, which isn't necessarily democratic in and of itself, but it's a move in a direction of at least more stable and more professionalized government. So Solon, again, is just one step. There are other famous individuals that came before and after that took, were part of this process of moving towards democracy in Greece. Eventually, you get direct democracy in Athens. I keep saying Greece and Athens. To some degree, I'm using them interchangeably. But we should keep in mind that Athens is the city-state that takes all this move towards direct democracy, eventually into direct democracy, the furthest. The other city-states, even Sparta, to some degree, are influenced by this. And so some of these things are partially true of other city-states, like Corinth and otherwise, but mostly true and carried to the fullest extent in Athens. So it's sometimes helpful and impossible not to compare Athenian democracy to American democracy. And you can see in sort of the simple Venn diagram here that there were a lot of differences, but there were certainly some similarities as well. And one of the things I think that strikes American students today when they look at Athenian democracy and get asked the question, how remarkable, really, which is to say, how democratic was the system? Remarkable because we don't expect to see democracy breaking out, in the ancient world. It was remarkable, but students today tend to see, I think, quickly, how limited the democracy was, not in the form of its institutions, but in the form of who got to participate. Because so many were left out as citizens, not counted as citizens, then American students today tend to say there wasn't really a democracy. Not enough people get to participate and vote, etc. Too many are left out. And that's certainly true. But then what we tend to miss if we focus on that sort of exclusively or too heavily is that the institutions, at least at their height, were quite democratic. Direct democracy meant that if you were a citizen, and if you're not included in this, but if you were a citizen, and there were citizens from all ranks of society in terms of class, income, and wealth, so from rich to poor and in between, you got to vote directly on major issues. You didn't vote for a politician who then represented you in a legislative body. That's what we call representative, democracy, indirect, participation. You vote for someone who then represents you in Congress or Parliament, whatever. This was citizens showing up and actually voting on the issues about whether to go to war and about taxes themselves. The politicians were there, and they usually did come from the elite, wealthy families, the noble families, but they're the ones who made speeches to try to convince you. And the main avenue or the main arena institution where this was done was called the assembly. So the citizens would assemble at the assembly site, and it was optional. You could show up or not show up. Sometimes thousands were there, sometimes less, depending on the importance of the issue, perceived or real. And the politicians were there to try to persuade. And maybe there's two politicians, say, speaking on a given day. One saying you should all vote yes on the issue, and the other making a dramatic or rational, argumentative speech on why you should vote no, just to keep it simple. But the point is that the citizens voted directly, and so if the decision was about whether we need to go to war or not, one politician argues for yes, one argues for no. The citizens in the audience that then vote among the assembly, they get to decide whether the country goes to war or not. So that is quite democratic. You could argue that it's actually not very good for society to be that directly democratic, but you can't argue that it's not democratic. So all I'm saying is that our tendency, because of what we're used to in our society, to think of as democratic, I think tends students to give the Athenians sort of low marks for being truly democratic because it excluded so many people, and that's certainly true. But that tends to get emphasized so much we miss the other side, and that it was really democratic in a sense more so than our society, in that citizens voted directly on the most important issues of the day. Now, of course, this was a small, by our standards, society, a few 100,000 residents of the city-state of Athens, so direct democracy was doable. With 330 million citizens, direct democracy is probably not doable. Maybe with computers and the internet today, it's interesting to think that maybe it is doable, but that would be a major hurdle to overcome. So maybe representative democracy is the only realistic way to do such a political system in a society with millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people. So we couldn't even do it the democratic way. Nonetheless, the Athenians were practicing direct democracy. But they weren't always sort of safe and sound and snug to do what they wanted, as so often happens in the world, which we've seen everywhere. And this came in most graphic fashion that with the threat posed by the big kid on the block, the Persian Empire. At that point in the Mediterranean basin area, there's no doubt that the Persians, by this time, were the most powerful empire. So they were the ones that everybody feared. They were number one. Now, I'm not comparing them with China or India. It's too far away to even make the comparison about who is more powerful. They're not in at least direct contact with each other. So let's just suffice to say in the Mediterranean region, which basically includes Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, it's the Persians at this point that are the dominant force. And they came to eventually notice the Greek city-states, and once they noticed them, they started to get involved in trying to control them. So the Persian Wars, there were two, a decade apart from each other, 490 to 480 BC, were, of course, gigantic and world-changing events in the Mediterranean world, particularly for the Greeks. And it seemed very unlikely that the Persians were going to be defeated by these dinky little city-states, even if, and they did, the city-states sort of allied with each other temporarily in a military alliance to work together because they had to fend off the Persians. Even united, however loosely, however temporarily, it didn't seem likely that they could defend themselves. It looked like they would go under to the Persians, as everybody else tended to. And so, in the first war, the Emperor Darius sent a large army, and he was defeated. Most famously, there were other military engagements, but the most famous is the Battle of Marathon, in which an outnumbered, really outdone, sort of in every way, in terms of weaponry and all that, but the underdog Athenian militia. Remember, these guys weren't even. There was an alliance, so the other city-states were involved somewhat here as well. That would be true more so in the second invasion 10 years later, but the at least Athenian soldiers weren't 24/7 soldiers. This was a citizen militia, which means they trained just once in a while and only formed as a military unit in the time of war. Other times they were back at their farm or doing whatever their job was. Not true of the Spartans, as we know. Their soldiers were soldiers all the time. They were ready to go, in their military barracks, basically 24/7. So this unlikely army, and then Darius's Persian force was, in terms of its military preparedness, somewhere in between. These were more or less full-time military, not quite with the same intensity of militarization in peacetime as the Spartans, but closer to that than certainly the citizen militia of Athens. So it looked like everything was going against the Athenian army, militia, but at Marathon, though undefeated through strategic, tactical maneuvering, they were able to rout Darius's forces, which was the key battle in eventually causing Darius to go home, and for the Persians to come back another day. They, I think, did not intend to give up, as we know they didn't in the end, but the Athenian and other Greek forces punched them in the nose just enough to get them to back off temporarily, which was a delay that allowed the Athenians and the other Greeks, their allies, to prepare better next time. One of the things they did in that 10-year interval was build a lot more ships, build a stronger navy, or series of navies that would ally together 10 years later. So they were a bit more prepared and had a more military defense the second time they were invaded. So the first Persian War ended up basically just buying them time by getting the Persians to go back and regroup and before they came back again. Marathon is famous even now. The Olympic Games, have an event named the Marathon, which is, some of you probably know this if you've run a marathon before. A marathon is 26.2 miles long. Why 26.2? Why 26? Why not 20 or 25? It's because that's the distance, apparently, that a messenger went from the field of battle at Marathon to Athens to bring the news of the Athenian victory over the Persians. So the Olympic Games today, and the Olympics, of course, come from Greece. There were Greek Olympic Games in this time period. One of the ways that we can see there was cultural similarities and cultural cooperation amongst the Greeks, not just in wartime, but in peacetime especially. So they were united culturally to some degree, even though they weren't united politically. But here, of course, in wartime emergency, they are united politically, or politically/militarily. But the Battle of Marathon we still see in our culture today, mainly through the Olympic Games, Greek in origin, but the event of that name, 26.2 miles, in honor of the distance traveled by the famous messenger. 10 years later, long enough for one Persian emperor to have passed away, and for his successor Xerxes to bring a much larger invading force, which has been estimated at 25,000 troops and about 500 ships, though the estimates do vary, we don't know for sure. But this time we see also a number of major battles, but maybe most famously at the naval battle at Salamis, a Greek leader, Greek general and politician named Themistocles, also through tactical and strategic brilliance outmaneuvered and really set a trap for a much larger Persian fleet and kind of obliterated it with an assist again from other city-states. The other, and maybe actually the most famous military event in this second Persian War was the Spartans at Thermopylae. If you've seen the movie 300, it depicts that conflict. About 300 Spartan troops held up the entire Persian army in a mountain pass for days. Before all of the Spartans were actually killed, because the Persian army did find a way through the mountain pass or around it. But nonetheless, the reason a movie gets made out of it, number one, it's famous, but it's famous because the Spartans showed their sort of typical courage and military prowess, even in a loss, right, laying down a sacrifice for the other city-states, particularly Athens, by holding up the Persian army for days. Right? A few hundred holding up thousands and thousands, is something to remember and something to honor. And it did probably help. It gave the rest of the Greeks more time to prepare defense and prepare for how to fend off the Persian army. So 300, the movie, most of you have probably seen it, is about this famous event. The movie, it's interesting. It's historically accurate somewhat, although I don't believe that the Spartans back in the day were all that worried about having six-pack stomachs. It's the first thing that struck me about that movie is it always has to be a Hollywood angle there to sort of make it interesting to modern viewers. Maybe some Spartans had six-pack stomachs, but I don't think they quite had the knowledge of about sort of diet and weight training necessary to get six-pack stomachs. Certainly they were in shape, but I don't know about six-packs. So for a second time, an unlikely thing to happen, even once, and that is for the Greek city-states to rally together, and whether together or not, to fend off the Persians, not once, but as I said, twice, was remarkable. Two upset victories over the number one power in the Mediterranean basin was enough to propel the Greeks, particularly Athens, to sort of greater and greater feats, to greater and greater fame, and respect from the rest of that part of the world. And so it brought sort of the golden age of Athens, you could say the golden age of Greece, but particularly Athens sort of on the heels of, on the other side of the Persian Wars. Now keep in mind, the Persians were still the most powerful empire in this region of the world. They just sort of went home and were never able to conquer the Greeks. So sort of like the United States lost in Vietnam and withdrew its troops and never, again had a say in what happened in Vietnam, at least directly. But nonetheless, the United States remained a superpower and one of the two, or maybe the most powerful country in the world. So the same is true here. The Persians are still the big kid on the block, but nonetheless, it's still amazing that the Greeks were able to defend successfully against them. The Athens, because they certainly feared that there might be another such invasion, since there had already been two in 10 years, formed something called the Delian League, which at its height had 150 or so members, other Greek city-states under the leadership of the Athenians as a military alliance to be more prepared the next time if it happened. So Battle of Marathon we see here. You can sort of read the quote there on your own. That sort of explains, at least briefly, this improbable victory on Salamis. Sort of the same thing with Themistocles and what he did to lure the Persian navy into a trap that ended up in a major victory for Greece. The Delian League, founded in 478, you can see all of its participants or members in yellow there, except for the parent or leader of the organization or alliance, Athens. The Athenians occupied a part of the Greek peninsula known as Attica. So you see Attica and Athens there. As Norman Cantor says, who I've quoted in earlier units, his book on antiquity, a defensive alliance of dozens and dozens of city-states, the Delian League established a levy on all members, meaning a tax of either ships or an equivalent amount of money, which was used to finance a large fleet, which under Athenian command was to protect all members. Athens was a very effective leader of the Delian League. So, but the Athenians were quite clever, and you could see their ambition and aggressiveness here as well. Remember, I said they were more aggressive in their foreign policy than the Spartans, even though the Spartans were the ones that had the fierce military reputation, well deserved. But the city-state of Athens used this alliance, yes, to help defend themselves and to mutually defend the other city-states. They all had a self-interest in helping each other out if they were attacked yet again by Persia or another foreign power. But the Athenians also used this to spread their own influence and power because they were the dominant and most powerful of the members of the Delian League. They used that to sort of bring those areas in yellow more and more under their own control and dominance. In this way, they actually carved out what most scholars think of as an empire. So it's not entirely clear how much this was an alliance and how much it was an empire. It was probably a bit of both. At the height of Athens' golden age, we see sort of the height of its democracy as well. And that is symbolized and can be seen in the gifted leadership of Pericles, the single most famous of all of the Greek or the Athenian leaders. As Cantor says, none could compare to Pericles, either in the brilliance of his policy or in the loyalty that he commanded. So Pericles, I won't go on and on about him, but he's a sign that the Greek democracy was at its height, not simply because of his own doing, but again, I'm showing him more as a symbol. He certainly participated and in an important way in making and keeping Athens a vibrant democracy, but he's also a symbol of the Athenians at the height of their golden age, in this case, the political side of it. So the golden age of classical Athens during the era of Pericles also sees the Parthenon built, as you can see on the left. Perhaps some of you have visited it. Some of you will in time. But one of the great historical sites in the Western world. So even architecture was sort of at its high point in this golden age. Some of you are probably familiar with golden ages in history because of games like Civilization 4 and what are they up to now? I forget. I haven't played it in a while. It's too addicting. So Charles Freeman says the period of Greek history, the classical period in which the Parthenon was built, has been given iconic status. Athens was basking in the glory of having defeated 2 invasions by the largest empire the Persians the world had ever seen. It was exalted as the defender of freedom against the forces of tyranny. So that's certainly playing it up a lot, but there's some truth in that. It was exalted, especially by the Athenians, as the defender of freedom, right? At least freedom in the sense of we're staying free of some other power, not so much in terms of individual freedom, though the latter is partially true. But then comes the disastrous Peloponnesian War, which for sure brought the Golden Age to an end. And this was not a war between the Greeks and an outside power like the Persians. This was a war between the primary powers in Greece. Yes, you guessed it, Athens and Sparta. We've already compared and contrasted them somewhat. We know they were allies against the Persians, but they'd always had sort of a long-term sort of suspicion and sort of long-term animosities, fear towards the other. So this had been brewing for a long time. Doesn't mean this very destructive and bloody war was inevitable, but maybe it was likely in time. While the Athenians were carving out their own empire slash defensive military alliance in the Delian League, the Spartans were not involved in it, and they formed their own Peloponnesian League, which was made up of sort of different city-states. So this is important to help us understand how disastrous the Peloponnesian War was, since both of the two most powerful city-states, who are by now rivals and increasingly suspicious of each other, have their own separate military alliances. It means that it's likely, and it's what happened in the end, that if the two go to war with each other, they're going to draw and pull their allies, Athens' Delian League and Sparta's Peloponnesian League, into a war, that's primarily between the two, primary city-states here. So the point is that without the Delian League, without the Peloponnesian League, it's possible this war could have taken place just between Athens and Sparta and left all the other city-states out, or maybe only drawn in a handful of them. But the alliance system, the two leagues that were created, ended up drawing almost all of the Greek world into this. There were some city-states that sort of didn't live up to their commitments, or had stayed out of the one of the or the other leagues. But for the most part, this ended up being like a world war for the Greeks. The entire Greek world drawn into it. The causes we won't really get into, but there had been mutual suspicion for a long time between the two. Remember the Persians, but the Spartans are suspicious of everybody, right? They're kind of naturally suspicious. That's why they became a garrison state in the first place. So they were prone to see any aggressive move by Athens as threatening to them, but they weren't entirely wrong either. We've just finished noting that Athens was a rather aggressive power and carved out an empire. So why wouldn't the Spartans see that as threatening to them? They would, and they did. But one of the things that the Athenians saw as menacing coming the other way was that Sparta was a landlocked city-state. Right? There's lots of coastline and islands here, so most of the city-states are maritime states, have a lot of seaborne trade, and usually naval fleets to protect that trade and to defend their coastlines against attack. But Sparta didn't have any coast. It was all inland. So the Athenian navy was the supreme navy in all of the Greek world and among all the city-states. So they felt confident that they could compete with Sparta militarily, not because their army was stronger. They knew that wasn't true, but they had a navy, and Sparta didn't have one at all. But as the Peloponnesian League became a force, Sparta's own military alliance, they started to ally with more and more Greek city-states that did have navies. And each one of them was small by comparison with Athens' navy. But when you started to add them up, and when the Athenians started to realize these small navies, if you add them up, they get close to the size of our navy, and they're on the same side in the same alliance, the Peloponnesian League, that's controlled by Sparta, who are our main rivals. So this caused fear in Athenian ranks increasingly, because now you could more or less say that Sparta has a very powerful army, which everybody already knew, and a powerful navy because its allies, and it's the leader of this alliance, have naval forces that, if cooperating with Athens and each other, can rival ours. Eventually, these mutual suspicions and this rivalry did turn to war. Pericles had his own strategy. He was around, at least the beginning of this war, which was controversial. And we'll see why it was controversial. Pericles might have been correct, by the way, though controversial. It's hard to say. But Pericles understood that the Athenian citizen militia was probably no match for the Spartans' land army on land. So he thought, if we go head to head with them, we're going to lose. So what he opted for, and tried to convince the assembly, and eventually did, barely, with a lot of controversy, was let's retreat within the wall. Athens was walled, and so was its port, several miles away. Something called the Long Wall, which sort of then had Athens and all the land between Athens and its port inside of walls. Let's bring all of the farmers and all the people living in farming villages out in the Attican sort of mainland inside the walls, and we'll fight a defensive war, at least on land. We'll be protected. We can defend the walls. They won't get into Athens. At least that was, they were confident of that. And then we'll use our navy, as you can see on the map there in blue, to raid the coastline of the various city-states of the Peloponnesian League, the allies of Sparta, and we'll wear them down. So it'll be a defensive war on land. We'll let them try to attack us and take Athens. They most likely won't. And in the meantime, we'll use our superior naval forces to raid and sort of hit in surprise attacks here and there, coastal areas onto the Peloponnesian Peninsula, which is where Sparta is. Well, why was that such a controversial strategy? Well, for a couple reasons. One, you're asking the farmers of Athens to leave their farmland and come within the walls. So even if it's meant to be temporary, they're not going to be comfortable doing that, because they know that a Spartan army is going to come trampling through right to there, possibly on their land, and trash it, which they certainly did. So people aren't going to easily leave their own land, especially if it's valuable, or if it's dear to their heart, as it usually is, if it's their home. So that's asking a great deal. Secondly, it seemed to many Athenian leaders and citizens alike as kind of a wimpy thing to do. It's like, wait a minute, we're retreating behind our walls. That's not how we show courage, and we have to do this the honorable way and go out and fight, man to man, army to army against the Spartans. So for both of those reasons, Pericles had a tough time. He did win a majority of votes in the assembly eventually, which may be testimony to his political skills and his oratorical speaking ability, persuasive ability, but he got his way barely. However, among other disasters for the Athenians in this war, there was a plague that broke out that decimated the city of Athens population at the wrong time, because it happened just after Pericles' policy got put into place, and so now basically the entire population of this whole city-state of Athens is behind the walls in Athens itself. Not just the normal citizens of the city, but now the farmers outside the city and the normal residents are all crammed together when a plague breaks out. So it decimates the population, and among its early victims is Pericles himself, who dies early on in the war. So he laid out the strategy, which which Athens mainly held on to throughout the war, but he was gone as leader. So they lost the war partly because the plague, sort of depleted them. They got worn down, and morale starts to go down as this long war. You can see from the dates, this is a long and drawn-out, bloody war. Now the dates are misleading. They didn't fight in all those times. There was at least one sort of major intermission where they kind of forged a ceasefire. But during that ceasefire, the Athenian leadership, minus Pericles now, made another fateful and bad decision. They decided to send a naval military expedition to Syracuse, which is a city or city-state on the island of Sicily. right now part of, or then part of Italy, which is pretty far away, which was probably not wise because, of course, it diluted then their navy and their military forces who were away. And sure enough, Sparta used that knowledge of their expedition to Syracuse to break the truce and start on a war again. So it basically unnecessarily divided Athens' forces. They were, in their minds, sort of going far away to try to hit a Spartan ally, far away, as an attempt to weaken them, but it just spread their forces too thin. Alcibiades became famous because of his expedition to Syracuse, which was defeated by Nicias, also famous because of sort of the showdown here. But Alcibiades became legendary and infamous, depending on who you talk to, because he changed sides in this from Athens to Sparta to Persia, which we won't get into for reasons of time. So after this long, bloody war, the Spartans do outlast the Athenians, who eventually have to sue for peace. And for a time, Sparta did actually control Athens and, in a sense, kind of conquered it. However, it didn't go very well. And as it says at the bottom of the screen, Sparta lost the peace, as they sometimes say, winning the war, losing the peace. And that's what happened here. The Spartans, first of all, didn't directly rule Athens, and they sort of put on sort of a puppet group of Athenian leaders who supported them, and we know that can be perilous. We saw that it didn't work in the end for one of the dynasties in Egypt. It didn't work in India. It can work, but it has its drawbacks. But there was another problem, I think. It's not the only explanation for why Sparta wasn't able to control Athens over the long term. They certainly did a ton of damage to Athens that was never entirely made up for, but they weren't able to rule it or control it anyway long term, partially because they didn't do it hands-on. They did it indirectly, as I just mentioned, but also I think there's something else that needs to be figured into this, and that is that Sparta, I don't think, was culturally prepared to make decisions for and about Athens. And it's because this was a landlocked, mainly rural city-state. Most city-states did have an urban center, not as big as Athens, but an urban center nonetheless. And most of them did maritime trade. Sparta couldn't because it doesn't have a coast, doesn't have a navy, doesn't have a huge trade. Sparta was a much more isolated city-state. As part of their militarization, their garrison state status, they pretty much sort of locked themselves in their own city-state. They didn't allow citizens to travel, with rare exceptions. They didn't allow many foreigners in to their country, with rare exceptions. But this meant that they didn't have then the same kind of cultural sophistication that the Athenians had. By having a thriving maritime trade, sending products, imports and exports, throughout the Mediterranean, the Athenians had a much more vibrant, open society, and it explains sort of the cultural achievements of the Athenians that the Spartans almost entirely lacked. When we get to Greek thought next, right? Sparta is not known and isn't talked about when we deal with Greek thought and Greek architecture and Greek playwrights. They're not even mentioned when we talk about that, for good reason. They didn't really produce any of this kind of culture. So their militarization and intentional isolation it was not conducive to high culture and cultural achievements, and not to a cosmopolitan spirit, not freedom of ideas being exchanged that you'd see almost naturally in vibrant cities, particularly port cities that have know about foreign customs and other people's beliefs and ideas, because they're dealing with them, at least at first, through trade on a daily basis. So Sparta, in its value system, right, was ill prepared to control and make decisions for Athens, which had a very, very different value system, a much more cosmopolitan one.